Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I recently finished a stint as a beta reader for another author who is about to put out a book. Nothing super unusual about that. I've done it a couple of times before, and I hope to continue to do it in the future. However, because of the timing of the situation, I didn't have a chance to go back and read the first book in the author's series. Now, you may be thinking that it's unfair to beta read a story that you don't have all the context for, but that's not entirely true. In fact, what I wanted to talk about today is the importance of writing a story that people can join in on partway through. I generally point to two instances in my own life where I came in quote-unquote in the middle of a story, and yet managed to enjoy myself immensely nevertheless. If you're wondering, the first of those was the first Avengers movie, which was only my second Marvel movie after Captain America, and Timothy Zahn's Odd Girl Out, which is the third book in the Quadrail Quintet. My experience on both of these occasions was a little hampered by the fact that I didn't have the full context for the story. There were allusions to other events that I didn't entirely understand, but the stories were written in such a way that I could very quickly come on board and enjoy the story that was being told, even though people familiar with the franchise up until that point would understand the things in a different light. Once I finished The Avengers, I was able to go back and enjoy the other movies in the MCU up until that point perfectly well, and I was then able to rewatch The Avengers and appreciate it in a slightly different way. Admittedly, after reading Odd Girl Out, I had several important plot points for Night Train to Rigel spoiled for me, so I don't actually recommend experiencing the Quadrail Quintet the way I did, but you can do it and still enjoy the rest of the series perfectly fine. While a first read-through of Night Train to Rigel does probably benefit from not knowing all of the twists of the story ahead of time, it's also a great story to go back and reread several times and appreciate the way all those twists are very cleverly set up and hinted at over the course of the story. So when I was reading through this manuscript on behalf of another author, what I was really thinking about is, does this story take all the necessary steps to draw in a new reader and get them invested in the characters, perhaps invested enough to go back and read the rest of the series? Well, the answer was yes. And since I don't want to spoil that story from you, I'll just go over a few of the general rules of thumb that I saw in that story and in the other ones that I mentioned here, Odd Girl Out and The Avengers, that really make it possible to come into the middle part of a story and still enjoy that part of the story. The first and most important thing is to have a self-contained story, a story that doesn't lean too heavily on a previous plot element to make everything work. Now, I'm not saying don't have continuity. Of course, your story should be internally consistent with itself, and it is fine if previous plot elements are important in a current story. But be sure to treat them as the backstory for your current story, a world-building element that has to be set up and established in your current story, rather than taking it entirely as a given. You don't have to be exhaustive or explicit about these things, but give someone enough to go on. The scene between Steve Rogers and Nick Fury in The Avengers is a perfect case study in this. It gives you all of the basic context of Steve's original story without spelling out his entire character arc or how he got where he wound up. A person who has already seen Captain America, the first Avenger, will understand the importance of all of that dialogue and all of the events of Steve's life that are kind of being glossed over there. At the same time, a person who is just watching The Avengers with no other context from the MCU gets a basic idea of who Cap is and what's important to him, at least at the moment, in that recap. Second, establish your characters, not just as characters, which is, foundational to introducing your cast in any story, but establish them as connected to the previous stories and hint at what their arc is going to be in the current installment of your story. Odd Girl Out does this most in its presentation of its villain. And since presenting that villain is the big spoiler for Night Train to Rigel, I can't really talk about that too much here. Although I think it's very interesting, the contrasts between its behavior in Odd Girl Out and its behavior in, say, even The Third Lynx, which is the second Quadrail novel. The Avengers does this most notably with Tony Stark, contrasting his selfish attitude in his first two movies with his need to develop a sense of self-sacrifice in the Avengers, and in Thor, who was first presented as a very self-centered character, but in this movie is now thinking more and more about his brother, and how to bring his brother back into the fold. Finally, you'll need to both add and remove context from your characters. What I mean is, each story should have at least one or two elements to it that are unique, that allow your characters to be seen in a way no other part of the story lets you see them. In The Avengers, of course, it's everybody coming together to form a team for the first time. The characters in that story feeling each other out and establishing what their relationships are going to be is a big part of the story. And of course, these characters can only have one first meeting. In Odd Girl Out, it's a very different thing. First of all, this is the only story in the series that primarily takes place in a human territory. The other Quadrail stories all take place in alien territories. Also, Frank and Beta meet a child, and they have to deal with a child, an element that they never have to deal with before or after. So we get to see them in almost parental roles for the course of this story, and it's very interesting and illuminates their characters in ways we won't get anywhere else. If each stage of your story introduces a new context for your character and removes a piece of context from the character, then you will never see the character in quite the same light in any given part of your story. By doing this, you can then encourage people to go back and see what characters were like in a different context, as well as encourage them to eventually go forward and again see their characters in a slightly different light as the story unfolds. It may even be beneficial to have characters point out that they are doing something remarkably different from what they did in the past, although that kind of thing can seem very heavy-handed to already established readers. And it is important to note that as you do these things, you should do them in a way that appeals to your established audience as well as the new audience who may pick up your story. Both The Avengers and Odd Girl Out were very good stories for fans of the franchises they were in, as well as new audience. The easy availability of on-demand media has weakened storytelling in a lot of ways, but I think the biggest one is that it has removed the need to draw in an audience every time. People are perfectly willing now to sit down and binge huge chunks of story in a day or two. The need to grip people every time and keep them coming back for more in spite of a week or months or even years between installments of your story is not as pronounced as it used to be. Nevertheless, if you hone these three elements that I've talked about, I think you're on a pretty good path towards keeping an audience that already appreciates your story and still being able to draw people in with later installments, even installments that are very much in continuity with previous installments. But that's just what I think. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.